Pacific salmon are one of the most iconic species of the Pacific Northwest and have been a cornerstone of cultural, spiritual, economic, and ecological importance to many Indigenous communities since time immemorial. Their unique life cycle, which takes them from freshwater streams to open oceans back to freshwater streams, is an integral part of coastal ecosystems and an important source of traditional food to human and non-human beings along their migratory routes. But as coastal ecosystems change as a result of the climate crisis and human activities, these important fish are becoming increasingly threatened and are now in a state of alarming decline. Today, we'll hear from some of the leading experts on the status of Pacific salmon conservation research and the steps communities are engaging in to manage this important fishery using a framework of two-eyed seeing that incorporates Indigenous knowledge systems and Western scientific methods to preserve this resilient animal. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for episode 7 of the BMSE Climate Action Series. We've got a full line of panelists today to walk us through the subject of Pacific salmon and two-eyed seeing in fisheries management. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in to introduce our first speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jonathan Moore, a professor at Simon Fraser University, where he holds the Libra Era Research Chair of Coastal Science and Management. At SFU, he leads the Salmon Watersheds Lab, a research group that focuses on freshwater biodiversity, watersheds, and global change, with particular focus on BC's river and their salmon. He works closely with a diverse array of collaborators and partner organizations to co-develop research and communicate their findings. We're so glad to have him with us today. Thanks for joining us, John. Please go ahead and start your presentation.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to join this today. I think it's a really important event and it's an honor, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm joining in from Simon Fraser University on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. And first, I just wanted to say I hope people are staying safe with the floods. It's kind of a scary time right now, and I hope you're taking care of yourselves and taking care of each other. So I just want to start by actually taking us underwater. And so if you stick your head underwater in a salmon stream, which I highly recommend, and you get over the shocking cold and the bubbles tickling your face, if you're lucky, you might see something like this. You might see hundreds of dancing salmon around you on their way up to spawn. And that's happening right now as we speak, up and down the coast, thousands of different populations of salmon going upstream, their life cycle unfolding. So they'll go upstream and they'll find a place where there's nice clean gravel, and they'll dig a nest, or they'll lay the gravel, lay their eggs. And then if the water is clean and cold, and if the gravel doesn't have fine sediment, those eggs will emerge over in the spring. And then maybe after a day, maybe after a few years, those fish will go downstream in an amazing hidden migration downstream towards the estuary, towards the ocean. That life cycle continues. And as these watersheds are connected by flows of water and migrations of fish, they're also connecting people as well. And so I think it's really important that we really acknowledge and highlight the fact that these systems have been stewarded by Indigenous peoples for millennia. And Wet'suwet'en fishers in this picture here, fished in these systems on these very rocks passed down generation to generation. And if we think about this life cycle, unfolds over habitats, and it also unfolds over different challenges. And we're seeing a lot of those challenges now. And so, across their life cycle, salmon are, being hit by ocean heat waves in some years. We just sort of witnessing a massive series of floods that could scour out eggs and kill that generation, or hot waters like we saw this summer. And so climate change has all these different symptoms that are happening now, and it is a real urgent challenge. But of course, it isn't just climate change. There's a lot of different land use activities. We live in these systems also, and we extract resources from them. And so here's some time-lapse footage over about 30 years of a place in interior BC where there are threatened and endangered salmon, and where logging has harvested a lot of the forests away. And when that happens, flows change, water temperatures warm up as well. So what do we do about it? And this is a question that we think about a lot, and I'm excited to discuss with you all today. How can we best steward salmon watersheds in this era of change, in this era of climate change and multiple stressors? What do we do about it? And I actually think there's a lot we can do, and I'm excited about the opportunities facing us, even though they are a large challenge. So I think the first point I want to make is that climate change and human pressures don't operate in isolation. Climate is warming waters. Forestry can warm waters. Climate is increasing the risks of flooding. Forestry can increase the risk of flooding. So that's just one example where, maybe we should be thinking about what actions can we take, where, for example, forests could be managed a little bit differently so that it allows systems to be more resilient to oncoming climate change. The second point I want to make is that these systems are really being transformed rapidly by climate change in some of these cases. So we've been working on estuaries quite a bit, and sea level rise, as well as encroachment by human development on these systems, is a grand challenge. And so working up and down estuaries up in the coast in partnership with many different First Nations and other groups, we've been learning about the different types of habitats that these young fish use on their way from the river to the ocean. And increasingly, we're discovering that it seems like these habitats that connect the freshwater to the ocean are a really critical phase in their life cycle stopover habitats. So for example, in one of the systems where we work, we discovered that young salmon seem to grow about 9% because of their rearing in the estuary. Which, when I first saw that, frankly, I was like, not that impressed. I thought that's not a huge number. But then I sort of did the math and I realized, well, that's actually the difference between me and a top level NBA player. I'm sure there might be some skill differences as well, but the bottom line is that 9% actually is a pretty substantial difference in size that could have quite large impacts. I don't think spending more time in estuaries would help me on my NBA career, but regardless, the point is that amount of growth can have huge impacts. And indeed, we're discovering that in estimating that translates into a 35% increase in individual survival for this population. So quite a big impact in the productivity and survival of this system. But if we think about sea level rise and it's happening, this is going to really transform these nursery habitats. Our partners are estimating that in this system, for example, the ocean will rise 25 centimeters by 2050 and 65 centimeters by 2100. So in places where the estuaries are intact, that estuary can migrate, it can evolve, it can adapt, it can be resilient to climate change. But in places where those red arrows are, for example, where dikes have been built, there isn't that capacity to adapt. And so this type of science can figure out what are the opportunities for example, breaching these levees and dikes for the system to evolve and cope with climate change, looking to the future, taking that knowledge and translate it into action. And this work is in partnership with Nature Trust BC. A similar transformation that's happening as we speak right now is as the snow and the ice melts, it's really transforming salmon watersheds. And so in some places, the loss of the snow and ice is really poses risks and harm. No longer will there be ice packs in the mountaintops that keep rivers cool downstream. But in other places, as the glaciers retreat and the salmon rivers lengthen, salmon are finding these new habitats actually and colonizing them. And there might be 10,000 new salmon in a place that's only a couple decades old. And so we've actually mapped that out, and we have a paper coming out in a week or so where we've predicted that there's actually going to be thousands and thousands of new kilometers of salmon rivers up and down the coast. And so we know where and roughly when there will be these new future hotspots of salmon. And this information can help us guide decision making. It can help us think about not just how do we protect salmon now, but how do we protect salmon in the future. And the last point I want to make is that salmon systems have just remarkable diversity, from their genes, their life histories, to the different habitats they use, whether it's deserts or alpine lakes or coastal rainforests, to the different ways of thinking, the different ways of management. All these components of diversity, all these layers of diversity, I think they're all puzzle pieces. They're all puzzle pieces to a problem that we don't really understand. But by keeping the pieces of the puzzle, we can really help steward and shepherd salmon systems into this uncertain future. Thanks for the opportunity to join you all.
Thank you, John, for introducing us to salmon and all the research that your lab is doing. Our second guest today is Laureneckert, a conservation scientist and PhD candidate at the University of Victoria. Lauren's current research interests include the intersections of Indigenous and Western sciences, Canadian environmental policy, and the role human values play in our relationships with wildlife. Beyond her research, Lauren is an avid science communicator, Raincoast Conservation Fellow, and National Geographic explorer. And now that we have a bit of background information on Pacific salmon, we're looking forward to hearing more about the framework of two-eyed seeing in fisheries management from Lauren. Thanks for joining us, Lauren. Please go ahead and start your presentation.
Thanks so much, Inari and Dr. Moore for that presentation. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Hoping you can all hear me okay and see my screen. Great, thanks. So thank you so much. I'm humbled and excited to be here today to present deeply collaborative work. This paper, Two-Eyed Seeing, an Indigenous framework to transform fisheries research and management, which I'll share with you guys today, it represents a shared effort across people, positionalities, and institutions as represented on this slide. And besides the name listed here, there we go. We were also able to work with an awesome illustrator, Nicole Marie Burton, whose work will appear within. And this paper was led by the truly amazing Dr. Andrea Reed, who is a NISCA fisheries scientist and assistant professor at the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries at UBC, as well as the principal investigator for the Center for Indigenous Fisheries. So now that we've heard from John about salmon, we're going to, for this short chat, zoom out a little bit, still thinking deeply about salmon and our relationship to them and their future, but also thinking about fisheries, ecosystem management, research, and who we are as people more broadly. And I have the honor to present the work here today that was foundationally made possible and graciously guided by Mi'kmaq elder, Dr. Albert Marshall, pictured here from the Eskasoni First Nation. And Albert brought the concept of two-eyed seeing forward into the world, into the academic literature. But in his humility, Albert is extremely insistent that he is not the creator of two-eyed seeing, rather the carrier of this teaching, who's responsible for sharing the concept through his actions. And I want to begin by starting in a way that Andrea does in this paper and many scholars model, and that is by speaking to my positionality. I am a settler scholar, a non-Indigenous scholar of European descent. I'm a conservation scientist. I'm also an auntie, a sister, a partner, a colleague, an outdoor enthusiast, researcher, a friend. I'm a visitor now on Nuchatlaht Nation territory, where I'm coming to you from, and where I'm currently wrapping up fieldwork from my canvas wall tent, which I will be packing up shortly. Apologies for any background noise or clutter. And it's from these many places, this positionality, that I come to you today to share this work. I also acknowledge, in acknowledging the territory I'm currently a visitor on, that I've benefited from violent historical and modern colonization, and reflect on what that means for my immense responsibility to follow the leadership of Indigenous scholars, teachers, language revitalizationists, and leaders, and many others in their efforts towards decolonization. Two-eyed seeing as a framework has existed by many names for a long time, but it's experiencing resurgence for a number of reasons, including growing recognition of inherent Indigenous rights. which have been formalized through policy instruments like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that frame the baseline, the bare minimum expectation for colonial nation states and their relationships to Indigenous people. There are also rising movements against racism, police brutality, and colonial systems injustice. Now, these movements are nothing new, but opposition to human exploitation, police, and racially motivated violence have cast global eyes to the stage of injustices faced by Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color in North America and beyond. The widespread nature of these movements and the underlying profound injustices are finally beginning to move institutions and academics towards accountability and recognition of the people, the knowledges, and the ideas that are privileged in our system. There's also growing recognition that there is no view from nowhere. There's increasing recognition of the reality of all of our diverse positionalities, and an increasing call to recognize ourselves, whether we be scientists, journalists, or people, as individuals with positionalities that color our perception. And finally, we are recognizing that there are many valid ways of knowing that could inform how we do things in the present. These ways of knowing are not made invalid by positionalities or by the fact that the people who carry other knowledges are shaped by their community, cultures, or relationships. John alluded to the fact that these many knowledge systems, Indigenous knowledge in particular, are not only valuable on their own rights and in service of sovereign nations, but are also critical in facing the global struggles we currently face with climate change, environmental crises, and biodiversity loss. You may have recently seen in the news a really cool research paper that emerged. An archaeological study pictured here confirmed what co-author Michelle George's family already knew about their Tsleil-Waututh ancestors' fishing practices, which is in this case that male salmon were targeted historically for thousands of years in order to sustain the fishery long term. While scientific tools and Indigenous knowledge reaffirmed each other in the case of this research, nations didn't need confirmation by Western science to know that their ancestors had stewarded and managed ecosystems and salmon since time immemorial sustainably. And nations also are taking back, are researching cultural practices of fisheries technologies that were made illegal by colonization, colonial systems, as pictured here by Nick Clark. And beyond the fisheries of the now Pacific Northwest, Indigenous peoples who represent less than 5% of the world's population, but are estimated to protect more than 80% of global biodiversity, are leaders in movements towards conservation, towards sustainable management. Clearly, the knowledge of Indigenous peoples the world over holds critical leadership in the direction of facing environmental crises. But different knowledge systems and the equitable bridging of them are often diminished by dichotomous discourse. So Western knowledge is often categorized as quantitative, factual, analytical, reductionist, and literate. Likewise, Indigenous knowledge is often considered to be qualitative, anecdotal, intuitive, holistic, and oral in nature. Now, many scholars have pointed out these significant problems with these unnuanced dichotomies. But for decades, the academy and research have attempted to confront these inherent differences between knowledge types and all the plurality within through exercises of knowledge integration or incorporation, where Indigenous knowledge is subsumed into pre-existing power structures and Western knowledges, which has sought to reinforce a colonial inequity. Moving beyond these oversimplified dichotomies and power imbalances, TwoEyed Seeing imagines and enacts a framework for knowledge bridging that welcomes plurality, where knowledge systems are different but equally valuable. Concepts like TwoEyed Seeing have been around for tens of thousands of years across multiple cultures. They include the Kawaswenta Haudenosaunee for the two-row wampum, the Ganma, a confluence of seawater and freshwater, which had mixed but remained separate for the Yolngu people of modern-day Australia, Now, Teruia, the Wakatara Maori for double canoe, is a contemporary metaphorical framework where two canoes are lashed together, kept separate, but motivated towards a common goal. And finally, TwoEyed Seeing, or Etowaptimuk in Mi'kmaq, embraces learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of mainstream knowledges and ways of knowing, and to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all, as envisioned by Elder Dr. Albert Marshall. It shares with the previous framework this idea of equal but separate knowledge systems working together, creating space for common ground and yet respecting differences. But central to TwoEyed Seeing is also an action imperative that the knowledge holder must bear the responsibility to act on the knowledge they hold and the knowledge that has changed them. So in conventional fisheries management, as we now know it, colonial approaches are singular in source of information. They're top-down, typically single-stock, commodity-oriented. And TwoEyed Seeing frameworks call us to move beyond this conventional vision of fisheries management, beyond the assimilation, power imbalances of Indigenous knowledge being incorporated into Western science, and towards a pluralistic system in which time-tested Indigenous knowledge systems can be paired with, not subsumed by, Western knowledges. Now, TwoEyed Seeing is extremely context-specific, nuanced, and complicated. So I'm not here to share boxes to check or a specific checklist approach to doing this research. But in analyzing case studies of TwoEyed Seeing in fisheries that have worked and iterative co-creation of the unfolding project that Casey will share shortly, we do see arising themes displayed in this figure that relate to how research can co-occur, how power and knowledge sharing can co-occur. And so the challenge that TwoEyed Seeing raises and puts forth to all of us is to fundamentally rethink not just how, not just why we do research, but also who we construct knowledge and make decisions for, and how we as researchers, academics, and humans in these complex and nuanced multi-knowledge systems can better come together to empower value and respect multiple knowledge systems on the path to co-creation and a better world. So that will be all for me today. I'm a bit over time. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat today, and looking forward to further discussion and following presentations.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for setting up that framework for us. Our next guest today is Casey Sterling, an Nglaka'imuk, Mi'kmaq, Métis, and Acadian scholar at the University of British Columbia's new Center for Indigenous Fisheries, led by her supervisor, Dr. Andrea Reed, who was the lead author on the framework that Lauren just presented. Holding a chartered herbalist diploma to complement the many teachings of plants gifted to her by her elders, Casey sees it as both a pleasure and responsibility being an Indigenous researcher trained in biochemistry, as she brings her perspective on TwoEyed Seeing in fisheries to science. We're so glad to have her with us today to share some of her work. Casey, please go ahead and start your presentation.
So thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to talk about the work that myself, Kate Mussett, the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund, and Dr. Andrea Reed are doing. And thank you to John and Lauren for setting up what you've already talked about today. I've titled my presentation Mishtenj, which is an Nglaka'imuk word for to try to do or learn something, because that's really what I try to keep in mind as I go through my education and the work that I do, just to try and keep focused that this is all a process and we don't need to know all the answers as we're going along. So much the same as how Lauren set up her positionality statement in her presentation, here is one way in which I am representing my own positionality in the way that it relates, as in the relationality, to the work that I do. I am Nglaka'imuk on my dad's side. I am Mi'kmaq and Acadian on my mom's side. I am a daughter, granddaughter, a new auntie. I'm a biochemist. I'm a herbalist. I come from a small town. And these are all important things to keep in mind when you are working in ethical spaces with and trying to work within ethical frameworks with the people that you work with, that you really need to be able to relate to who you work with and to position yourself within your work to be able to do true, honest, and ethical work and research. So as an Indigenous student, it was very unlikely that I would go into science, let alone biochemistry. And I often get asked why I chose to go into science or why I chose to go into biochemistry. And this really does speak to why I'm doing the work that I am doing now. I did my undergraduate degree in molecular biology and biochemistry at Simon Fraser University. And it seems very quantitative and focused, but the reasoning for going into this kind of work was that I grew up fishing. I was a young kid who was too curious and too stubborn not to ask questions. And so I was just going to be a researcher no matter what happened. But then I also, growing up fishing, I understood the impact that fisheries have within our lives, especially as Indigenous people. It was a familial tradition to go fishing and something that we did all year round. Fish were so important and continue to be so important in my family's lives and in many other Indigenous nations' lives and cultures. So for me, it was very natural to go into research involving biochemistry, but also especially into fisheries. And at the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, but also specifically within the project that myself and fellow master's student Kate Mussett are working on with the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund in the Lower Mainland in BC here. I start with a circle, much like how Lauren had in one of the slides of her presentation. The methodology we have is not linear, as is common in traditional Western academia, but it's cyclical. It builds upon the last work to continue doing good work moving forward. And that involves everything being co-developed from the moment of planning and planning for funding. If you're working with Indigenous nations, it's critical to plan with nations to understand the goals so that any work going forward is going to be equitable and going to be acceptable for all parties involved. Entrenched within that is relationship building, which I put separately here, but relationship building really does occur at every step of the process and should occur at every step of the process if the work that's being done is ethical. Right now, Kate Mussett and I are within our data collection and knowledge exchange period, but this is not happening just from us. Even though I am Indigenous, I'm not Indigenous to the lands upon which I am doing my research. And so we know that we do not have all of the knowledge to do the kind of work that is important to the nations here. And we were directed to the sites that we have as from the nations because they were seen as culturally relevant sites or sites of concern for many reasons for these nations. And so the data collection and knowledge exchanges is also going to include some interviews that we hold with nation members. Really could not happen in a sort of siloed way that wasn't co-developed. Throughout this process, we are reporting back to community, which is really important when working with nations. Some nations may only want one report at the end, but for the project that we're working on, we are continually reporting back at every step. It does take more time and more work, but it is the only way to co-develop equitably and ethically the type of work that we are trying to put forward. At the end of this month, we're going to have another workshop to update on what we've done up to this point as well. And much like Lauren mentioned, after this process, or even at several points throughout this process, it's important to, whether it be academic publications, multimedia publications, or reports, is to co-author and share the benefits of these types of outputs of this process. Here's a picture of Kate Mussett on the left, myself in the middle, and Dr. Andrea Reed on the right on our first field day for this specific project. And this I put in here also just to remind that these sites we go to are important to the nations who we work with and who we are doing this work in service for. So we did not at any point assume that we knew more than the nations and choose sites based off of what we thought was important. It was important during this project to keep in mind our positionalities and to understand that these specific sites, the nations we work with, have the most and the richest knowledges about these sites, and they know best which questions to ask in these places. For my specific little part of the project, I'm going to be looking at ethical space within Indigenous science, but also a survey of environmental DNA, or eDNA, of diatom species, which are little algal species, algae, that are really good indicators of different environmental pressures, which could be temperature changes, pH changes, pollution that comes into a system. And this has been done a little bit in Europe, but not so much in the North American context. So we are trying to see if this is something that could be used within this project, especially because of the fact that it could be something that could be used for monitoring, like in young salmon habitat, as John Moore was saying, was so critical. But it could be done at very rapid timeframes, which is really critically needed in the times that we're in today. So Kukshem Walalan, thank you all, merci for listening. And I have one last slide just for some resources that I'll hold on here for a little bit. If anybody feels like looking into some of these websites or books or podcasts, please do take either a screen share or a picture of this slide, because it's important to read into all the other works that are going on from other Indigenous scholars trying to do good work in these fields. So Kukshem Walalan, thank you.
Thank you so much, Casey, for sharing a bit about your own story and the work that you do within these ecosystems. And we'll be sure to share the resources that you put up in the show notes so people can have further access to those. Just a brief reminder to the audience, if you have questions that come up as we're going through, feel free to drop them in the Q&A function. We'll try and relay those to the guests during the Q&A period. Our final guest today is Councillor John Jack, a 3-term member of the Executive Council for the TwoEyed First Nations, a modern treaty nation on whose traditional territory we're streaming this episode from. John has held nearly every major file in his portfolio and currently oversees the finance and climate change portfolios. And in addition to his role on council, he is the nation's representative to the Alberni-Clayoquot Regional District and has been its chair since 2016. It's our pleasure to have him join us today to share with us the significance of salmon in the TwoEyed First Nation and a bit about the process for how resource management decisions are made regarding this important fishery and habitat management. Thanks for joining us, John. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm going to go pretty quickly here because I have a lot to cover. So I'm from the TwoEyed First Nations. We're located on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And I think the major context here is that we have a treaty, a self-governed treaty with BC and Canada. And that provides for us many of the tools legally and politically that other First Nations might not have. So there's a lot of things that we can do to act on our objectives in order to manage our resources or land, as well as create the rules by which our community will follow. So that law and decision-making authority over land and resources is primarily the tool by which we would be managing for the resource use of salmon, both in a modern context, but also in a traditional one that calls into our traditional values and our heritage and the identity upon which we have for the most part. If you saw in the sponsors bit for the couple seconds there, you would note that the words underneath our logo are ancient spirit, modern mind. And really the idea behind that is that we're trying to fuse the traditional and cultural values that we bring from the past, our ancient spirit, with the modern economic opportunities created by the world that we live in, as well as the climatic necessities that are happening now and have been for the past generation or two. But it's those traditional values that are perhaps the most important thing that guides our government and our people in how we talk about and how we conceive of the challenges and opportunities in front of us. And when you start with values, ideally, what happens is that filter is the way in which you create a decision-making framework that will ideally balance the requirements of your community in a modern era with not only your values from the past, but also that which you want to be into the future. So I'm going to cover off 3 of our traditional values now that guide how we make decisions. The first upon which is Izak, which can mean greater respect. It's not just the word respect. It's a state of being, a state of acting, a state of behavior. It can also be called respect with caring. Ideally, it is a demonstrated act of respect between groups, primarily. So if we think back in terms of the history of the Hawaiian First Nations and other Nuchatlaht nations, the way in which decisions were made were by the light of the Big House Fire. And interactions between families or groups within the nation or between nations themselves tended to be done deliberatively in front of almost everyone in the community. And the utility in that was that we didn't have the written word, but we did have people who could remember what was going on. And so decisions were contemplated and deliberated and decided and announced in front of people who would be paid to remember these things, because a resource agreement or a mutual protection pact might only become necessary to be active 10, 15, 20 years from when it was originally agreed upon. And suddenly that 20-year-old in the back is the only person who was there and could verify that this was done this way or this was done that way. But Izak is more than just the relationship between people. It's also the relationship between all of those things in the human world and all things in the natural world and all things in the spiritual world as well. And that concept of respecting everything within multiple systems is something that bridges into our next value, which is Hishuk Masawak, which is the idea that everything is one. And the best way that I've found is that Hishuk Masawak is the appreciation and acknowledgement of, if not the complete understanding of, the interconnected, interdependent, and reciprocal relationships between all things within the worlds I've already spoken on. And then you can see this at work in regards to the effect that a misspoken word can have an impact on a family for generations, or the way upon which we decide to manage our lands for forestry can have an impact on salmon runs, as Dr. Moore has already showed us. And it's that appreciation and acknowledgement, if not complete understanding, of those complex, interconnected, interdependent, and reciprocal systems is something that we bring forward. And we do so with the framework of our third value, which is uatlak. And unlike the others, it's a verb. It means taking care of. And in our context, it has 2 meanings. The first of which is restricted to the ways and means of our hereditary leaders, the Hawaiian, or singularly the Hawaiian. They have ways upon which they deliberate with one another and make decisions, and we're not supposed to talk about that, so I won't. But in a public context, we also talk about taking care of our people and our community and our lands and our waters for present and future generations. And that's the long-term holistic thinking that we need to think on. And all of these values kind of speak to something that Ms. Eckert has already stated, that we don't view ourselves as somehow separate from the natural world. In fact, we're a part of it. And ignoring that relationship is something that leads to many of the problems that we've already crashed into, or in some contexts have crashed into us. Specifically on salmon, though, I think it's important to note that salmon is central to our cultural and traditional identity. It's our primary foodstuff, and the annual cycles of salmon and the species coming in and leaving at different times of the year, that really determines a lot of the annual cycle and our concept of time that Hawaiian has. And that it's not only managing the harvest, but also the waste disposal of the waste products from salmon, as well as managing the land, rivers, and streams. They're all vital in managing salmon in a way that will sustain us. And historic management, according to our values, it resulted in a thriving culture that built upon food surpluses that provided for a more sophisticated society, where people were socially able to have specialized roles, economically able to have specialized roles. Not everyone was working on mere subsistence, and that's the basis and foundation of society. Now, this is in marked contrast to the commodity-based thinking dominant in industrial and capitalist models that we're now currently under. I mean, we have a number of commercial fishermen who have gone away. We're continually affected by sports fisheries. And forestry is our number one economic driver in the region. These things affect salmon in ways that need to be contemplated. Our challenge is to balance that approach. And it starts with our values, which determines our goals. And those goals help continue into using the science and our traditional knowledge to synthesize some sort of hybrid model that will manage based on what we value as a people, rather than purely a commodity-based approach under the system we're in now. That means that we have to have an integrated approach to how we manage our rivers, our streams, our land, our community planning and forestry, and everything in between. And that requires diverse voices. And I think it's been mentioned already, also requires us to have systems and models that are both transparent and accountable to make sure that these things can happen. So it's processes like that and the dialogue we're having now that contribute to that. And I think I'll just leave it at that because I'm a bit over time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing that with us. And audience members, if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. But I have one just to start off that I'd love each of your insights on. So you can go ahead and start your cameras, all of our guest speakers today. This past June, the federal government announced the Pacific Salmon Strategy, a 5-year program to save declining Pacific salmon through conservation, hatcheries, and harvest transformation. I'm curious to hear each of your perspectives on what you think should be prioritized in this plan, and what should be targeted first. So we'll just go in order of presenters. If Dr. John Moore, if you could please go first.
Yeah, thanks. Great question, and wonderful to see those presentations. Super inspiring. Yeah, so with these investments, it's wonderful to see the government making them and the government's making them. And I guess I'd say that I think there's a real need for the investments to be thinking long term and thinking about, and so I would like to see perhaps more investment in is thinking about how could these systems be managed differently, systems as a whole. And so speaking to what John was talking about is how can we these sort of interlinked parts of the system be done in a way so for thriving watersheds for salmon and people.
Thank you. Lauren, do you have any insights into this?
I'm going to happily defer to other experts here about this plan in particular, though my overall broad comment is that increasingly we are witnessing legal challenges that make clear, even in our colonial framework, the rights of Indigenous nations to sovereignly manage their own territories, which they have done for thousands of years. And so a key aspect of, even these federal policies coming from the colonial nation state that is Canada, is to recognize the rights of nations to make their own decisions and to move power in the form of finances and investment into the hands of nations to make their own decisions about their management strategies. So that's my overall comment there, but keen to hear from other folks here.
Thank you, Lauren. Casey, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, similar, very similar to Lauren. I do think that Indigenous-led initiatives should take a priority in the funding here because there are many Indigenous-led initiatives for salmon conservation and rehabilitation all along the coast of BC and inland that are very often overstretched and have many capacity needs. And this kind of funding could definitely alleviate some of those needs.
Thank you. Councillor John, do you have any a comment on this as well? And I can repeat that if you want. I know it's
yeah, if you could, I just want to see how I frame
just
it.
wondering on what your thoughts are. What should be prioritized in the Pacific Salmon Strategy, the 5-year program to save declining salmon, where you think should be prioritized first in this plan?
I'm going to get really abstract because that's what I do. But I do think that we need to think about salmon as more than just a commodity, as more than just something that has a value per pound per fillet or steak. That there is more to this than just the value, the caloric value, although the caloric value there is there. It's one of the healthiest foods that we have on the West Coast here. I do think, though, that we do need to determine what and how we evaluate salmon from a cultural and food perspective before we think about it from a commodity perspective. And it needs to go in that order. And I think this is somewhere where the interactions between First Nations, the commercial fishery, which is the primary proponent of a commodity-based model, but also the sports fishing industry, which is some sort of hybrid in between because of the way that sports fisheries is put forward as being an experience, a cultural one, in fact. How do those things intertwine, and how do we start there? How do we evaluate those things so that the top level, this is what we need to do, this is our this is our end goal for the species, needs to fall from that, so that it's not a tussle during those determinations where we're trying to push scientists left, right, and center to come up with a report that says things in a certain way. If you settle the values out first, then the reports flow from that. And that's a tough conversation, but it still needs to be had, because that makes the scientific and traditional knowledge applications much more pointed, and the answers come much more clearly when we're not arguing over terms or how we evaluate salmon as a whole.
Thank you. We have a question from an audience member. Eileen is wondering what effect the present floods in the Fraser Valley will have on salmon stocks. And I know, Dr. Moore, you briefly touched about this. Did you want to comment on that question?
I can. Yeah, so the floods in the Fraser and beyond are of concern for salmon stocks. And so, these rivers naturally flood, but what we witnessed is not typical. And so the concern is that it scours out those buried eggs, and those will die. And so it's all sort of context dependent. It depends on whether the valley is very constrained or very wide, whether the floodplain has room to move, whether there's sort of, whether the watershed is protected or not, what the spawn timing is. But yes, I think, and science has found this, that in years following massive floods, the population takes a major hit. And so I would imagine that's happened over the last week.
Yeah, those have been devastating. Lauren and John, and Lauren and Casey, I appreciate how you started your presentations by acknowledging your positionality and setting it up from that framework. So this question is for Lauren and John. What are key lessons you've learned as settlers working in this space that you think other people would benefit from knowing? Lauren, do you want to go first to answer that?
Sure, happy to. I think I always struggle acting as an authority at all in this space, but this question I feel like I can provide some insight into. And it requires vulnerability, answering a question like this, but so does being a settler in Indigenous led spaces. As settlers, as white folks, we have the most to learn when it comes to understanding positionality, race, other ways of knowing, and we need to behave as such. And a lot of constant self-vigilance is required in this work, because I have made many mistakes in navigating this work, because I have a lot to learn, and I will continue to make mistakes, so hopefully less and less as I go. And I don't want those mistakes to come at the cost of the time, effort, and energy of Indigenous partners who are engaged in this research and spending their energy there. So I think recognizing that we will make mistakes, talking to each other about those mistakes, talking to other settler scientists about those mistakes so they may be avoided, and also leaving space to recognize, oh, that impulse is white saviorism. Oh, that impulse is unacknowledged, biases I have that I need to confront. We are not the leaders in this work. We should not be the leaders in this work. And constantly learning and reimagining where we fit into this picture is really important as settlers scholars. So my main takeaway is just recognition of our positionality and willingness to make mistakes and be vulnerable about those mistakes. I have been very, very lucky to work in the communities and with the people I have who have been gracious and kind and leaders in these spaces. So that is my rather vague, but hopefully helpful answer.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Lauren. John, did you have any lessons or insights you wanted to share from your collaborative work?
Yeah, again, I'm sort of hesitant as I don't think of myself as an expert in this, but I am trying. So I'll share a few things. Echoing Lauren. The first thing is, I think, as Lauren said, just bringing that humility and just trying to listen and just trying to not talk and just listen. And I remember once I was giving a talk and I said something like, we discovered that this is a new herring spawning location. And an elder stood up and said, Dr. Moore, respectfully, you did not discover this. We knew this for, millennia. And it was such an important moment. I really appreciated just being, showing how out of touch I was with reality. And so that I think is a really key thing. Another key thing is each place is different, and just sort of really trying to sort of take your time in each place and just be thoughtful about developing those relationships, and again listening to what's needed, and if anything's needed, maybe it's not appropriate for us to be in that place in that time. And the other thing for me, at least, is just trying to be aware of the deep environmental injustice in some of these places. It's a hard thing, but it's really important to realize that these ecosystems, they've some of them have been really sort of sites of pretty gnarly things that are. So it's good to understand and just try to think about that history. And so when I first got to BC, I think I was sort of more of I'd read my papers, I'd read my textbooks, and I'd go to a place like, I want to answer this question here. And it became apparent was not the appropriate. And so I now think about science, trying to sort of collaborative science, trying to sort of emerge from a place, emerge from a people, emerge from the conversations rather than coming from outside.
Thank you. Casey, you mentioned that you're an Indigenous researcher, but you work within different nations. Do you have any insights on what you've learned from that process, or what you wish people knew more of in the context of watershed management or your research?
Yeah, I've definitely learned so many things from the nations who've graciously hosted me throughout my education and my work here. But there is one common thing I think that many Indigenous scholars and professionals experience in just broader colonial society in general. It doesn't have to be within watershed management. Unfortunately, we're still at a place where most people don't understand the fact that Indigenous people are contemporary people. We understand contemporary concepts. We engage in contemporary concepts. We are often leaders within these fields. And I think it's such a residual legacy from colonialism and residential schools to think that Indigenous people have lesser intelligence or have that their knowledges are not as valid, but we have knowledge systems that date millennia that are incredibly rich, and we also are able to participate in modern conversations with the knowledges that we hold, that these are millennia's old knowledges, in addition to some of the new data that we're getting through modern technology. This is all stuff that Indigenous people commonly do day to day. And I think so many people still do not realize that.
Thank you for sharing that. That really makes me think about what Councillor Jack was just sharing about Hûʻayat First Nations motto, Ancient Spirit, Modern Mind. And I'm curious, Councillor John, if you would share a little bit about some of the initiatives happening within the Hûʻayat First Nation when it comes to fisheries management, salmon habitat conservation, along those lines.
So the way upon which we've been managing for salmon has been largely in regards to preserving and expanding the yields of various known rivers and streams. And that's changed over time to kind of understanding the relationship between our expanded forestry operations and how that might affect salmon stocks, but also, and I think this is the other way in which we're starting to think about it in real terms, is not just yield, but what is the total resilience of the system, and that you can manage to build resilience in as well as pure yield of salmon in, salmon out sort of idea. And it's becoming apparent, not just with what we're doing in forestry, but that we're managing for resilience as much as we are for yield of salmon. And this is something that is starting to be considered in an integrated approach. So HWID is embarking on an integrated resource management plan, starting with the ideas that balance forestry and fisheries, because those are principal either economic or cultural identities, and more so cultural on the fish side and more so economic on the forestry side, but the Venn diagram overlaps. And so finding the balance there is a combination of what we're doing already, which is taking stock of the lands we have, altering our management principles that may affect rivers and streams, and also contributing to salmon stocks by operating a hatchery, taking note and keeping track of what's happening. But also, what are the other things that we could be doing in regards to watershed renewal and restoration, especially after the industrial level of forestry that had been done even before my lifetime in the 50s and 60s. It was the Wild West, and they were building roads across estuaries and all of these crazy things that we're just now understanding the impact on. And so when we're building back to whatever the natural equilibrium might have been, there's a lot that has changed in the landscape. And it's not a slice of time, it's a vector. Things have already changed to a degree in which we need to understand the degree and severity of change over time to hopefully balance for that, and balance and create a plan for building yield and resiliency in the system. And that's becoming larger and larger, or more intimidating, I suppose. And it's something that we need to continually do, but also build in systems to understand how we're doing and whether or not what we're focusing on is actually the real problem. And I think that's where science and the work that biologists, environmentalists, ecologists, you're the ones being able to provide for us the context in which we can make decisions, because we can wrap our heads around, this is exactly what Casey was saying, we can wrap our heads around that if it's presented in the right way, and use that as how we decide how we're going to manage things in a way that is akin to our values. And that's where that synthesis is. That's where the real teamwork happens. And it's learning about one another. So just as much as you need to learn about how perhaps you speak when you're talking about discovering something or using something, First Nations leaders are learning the language of how to talk about these things, because we need to learn that language to understand it better, because we're not locked into the past. We don't think like it's 1890s the same way that we don't celebrate Christmas like it's the 1890s in kind of Western society. People move and adapt and change. But we also have to interact with a world that thinks like that primarily. And we need to be able to translate our values into ways that federal bureaucrats understand. And if they may not need to accept it, because we'll just go over their heads and talk to ministers who will have to, but we need to understand it so we can present it in the language that is understood by the people who still have a lot of the power. Less so for us because we're a treaty nation, but it's not just about that. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very insightful. I am mindful we're nearing the end here, and we're so grateful that all of you could join us today to learn together. As usual, this is just such an introduction to the topic. And so if anyone has more questions, for the audience or for the presenters, please send them to us and we'll try and relay those to the presenters after the webinar. And as usual, we'll end today's episode with our climate action recommendations. And first up, we know that salmon have been an important food source for hundreds of nations in the Pacific Northwest since time immemorial, and that salmon food culture is threatened by the climate crisis and other human activities like logging or coastal development. And the industrial food system is a major driver of the climate crisis globally, but it's also an opportunity for climate justice through agricultural and food system reform. And so we recommend to you, the National Observer has a great podcast called The Race Against Climate Change. So their first episode has to do all about the complexities of the food system. And so we suggest this as a launching point for you to start thinking about food systems and sustainable food systems in your own community. Secondly, one of the main threats to salmon is via habitat loss. We've seen that today. Dr. John Moore shared a great video depicting this. And one of the best ways to protect vital habitats in North America or Turtle Island is through land back, a long-standing movement organizing to put unceded land back into Indigenous hands. And right here in northern Vancouver Island, the Nuchatlaht Nation is in legal challenge with the province and federal government to get their land title back. So you can help fund that either financially through their land back fund or by learning about other local contexts of land back movements near you if you're in a colonized state. And finally, we want to recognize and acknowledge the devastating storms, flooding, and landslides that have been happening in our region of the world this past week. And our thoughts go out to the folks who've been displaced as a result of these weather extremes driven by the climate crisis. And we know these kinds of events disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. And it's quite blatantly obvious how ill prepared the province is for the climate crisis, even as it's hit us full force in the last year with fires, heat waves, and now floods. So we'll share some opportunities in our show notes for you to engage in some mutual aid, either by donating finances or your time, but also organizing towards demanding a better provincial plan to the climate crisis. As simple as it sounds, caring for other people is climate justice and climate action. Our next episode streams December 8th. We'll dive into the world of marine renewable energy. And by popular demand, we're ending this week's episode with a joke again. Why doesn't the salmon watch their favorite TV show on cable? Why, you may ask? They prefer to stream it. Yeah, so you're welcome. Thank you all for joining today, and to all of our presenters. We've learned so much, and we'll see you next time.